The letter he never read. There are moments in television history that millions witness but nobody truly sees. Nights when the cameras capture everything except what matters. The Tonight Show, Studio 6B, Burbank, California, March 1981. Johnny Carson and Bob Hope sat across from each other under lights so bright they erased shadows. Between them, folded inside a plain white envelope, was a letter that would never be opened. Most people remember Bob Hope as eternal, the man who never aged, never faltered, never stopped moving. USO tours, television specials, golf tournaments, presidents on speed dial. At 77, he still walked onto stages like he owned them. But that night, something in his eyes looked different. Not tired, worse, unsure. Johnny had known Bob for decades. They'd shared stages, traded jokes, survived the machinery of fame together. But their relationship existed in that strange space where professional warmth never quite becomes personal truth. They were friends the way soldiers are friends, bound by shared territory, not shared secrets. The show started like any other. Audience filed in, warm-up comedian got them laughing. Ed McMahon announced Johnny with the same booming enthusiasm he'd been using since 1962. Johnny walked through that curtain doing what he always did, smiling, waving, making it look easy. 20 years of walking through that same curtain, and he'd perfected the art of arriving without actually showing up. Bob Hope was the third guest that night, not the main event. That alone told you something. There was a time when Bob Hope didn't sit third. But television, like everything else, has a way of rearranging hierarchies while nobody's looking. The young comedian who opened barely knew who Bob Hope was. The actress who sat second kept checking her watch. Only the people in the audience over 50 leaned forward when Ed announced his name. Bob walked out to applause that was warm but not thunderous, respectful, the kind of applause you give to history, not excitement. He wore a gray suit that fit him perfectly because Bob Hope never wore anything that didn't fit perfectly. But when he sat down, Johnny noticed his hands. They were shaking, just slightly, just enough. "Bob Hope, ladies and gentlemen," Johnny said, and the audience clapped again, longer this time, as if trying to make up for something. "Johnny," Bob said, settling into the chair. "You're looking well, still skinny." "Still can't gain weight no matter what I eat," Johnny replied. "You're looking good too." "I'm 77, Johnny. I look like a 77-year-old man who's had good lighting." The audience laughed. Bob smiled. But Johnny saw it, the smile that didn't quite connect to the rest of his face. The performer's muscle memory doing its job while something else entirely happened behind it. They talked about golf. They always talked about golf. It was safe territory, neutral ground. Bob told a story about playing with Gerald Ford. Johnny told one about playing with Jack Lemmon. The audience laughed at the right moments. The band played them in and out of commercial breaks. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. But during the second commercial break, Bob reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an envelope. White, standard size, slightly bent from being carried. He held it for a moment, looking at it like he wasn't sure what it was. Then he looked at Johnny. "My son gave me this," Bob said quietly. The studio was loud with crew movement, audience chatter, music, but Johnny heard him perfectly. "Christopher, my youngest." Johnny knew about Christopher. Everyone in television knew about Christopher Hope, the son who'd never quite found his footing, who'd struggled with things his father's generation didn't have names for. Depression, they called it now. But in Bob Hope's world, you just worked harder and smiled wider. "He asked me to give this to you," Bob continued. "Said he wrote it for you. Not for me, for you." Johnny looked at the envelope. He didn't reach for it yet. "He knows I watch the show," Bob said. "Every night. Even when I'm on the road, I watch. He knows that." Bob's voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. "He wrote you a letter, Johnny, and he asked me to deliver it. Can you imagine that? My own son, and he writes to you." The floor director was counting down. 15 seconds. Bob held out the envelope. Johnny took it. Not because he wanted to, because Bob was handing it to him and there was no graceful way to refuse. "Don't read it now," Bob said. "Later, when you're alone." 10 seconds. Johnny slipped the envelope into his own jacket pocket. 5 seconds. The red light came on. Bob Hope's face transformed. The uncertainty vanished. The legend returned. He launched into an anecdote about entertaining troops in Korea and the audience was his again. Johnny played along. He laughed. He reacted. He did what he'd been doing for 20 years, but his hand kept drifting to his jacket pocket, feeling the edge of that envelope. A letter from a man he'd never met, delivered by a father who couldn't read it himself. The segment ended. Bob stood, shook Johnny's hand, waved to the audience. He walked off stage and Johnny watched him go. Watched the way his shoulders sat just a little lower than they used to. Watched the way he paused, just for a second, before stepping into the darkness beyond the lights. The show continued. There was still another segment to fill. A comedian Johnny had never heard of doing material about airline food. Johnny laughed at the right moments, asked the right questions, but he wasn't really there. He was thinking about that envelope. About Christopher Hope, somewhere in Los Angeles, watching his father hand a letter to a stranger on television. After the show, Johnny went through the motions, shook hands with the guests, thanked the crew. Ed asked him about getting drinks. Johnny said he was tired, which was true, but not the reason. He walked to his dressing room, closed the door, and sat down at the mirror surrounded by lights that made everything visible and nothing clear. He took out the envelope. It wasn't sealed, just tucked closed. He could open it easily, should open it. Bob Hope's son had written him a letter and gone to the trouble of having his father deliver it on national television. That meant something. That required a response. But Johnny didn't open it. He sat there holding it, looking at his own reflection, and he thought about his own father. Homer Carson, a lineman for the power company in Norfolk, Nebraska, a man who believed silence was strength and distance was dignity. Johnny had left Nebraska at 24 and never really went back. Oh, he visited. Holidays, obligations, but he never went back in the way that mattered. His father died in 1959. Heart attack, quick. Johnny got the call while he was preparing for a show. He finished the show, flew to Nebraska, stood at the funeral, shook hands, accepted condolences, and never cried, not once. Because that wasn't what Carson men did. They'd never talked, not really. His father watched him on television but never said what he thought about it. Never said he was proud, never said he was disappointed, just watched. And Johnny never asked. Never pushed. Never wrote a letter saying all the things he could never say out loud. And now here he sat, 22 years later, holding someone else's unsaid words. A son trying to reach a father through a stranger. Using Johnny Carson as a messenger because direct communication had become impossible. Or maybe had always been impossible. He put the envelope in his desk drawer. Told himself he'd read it tomorrow. Tomorrow came. He didn't open it. Told himself he'd read it that weekend. Weekend came. Didn't open it. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The envelope stayed in the drawer, unopened, gathering the specific kind of weight that only unread letters carry. He saw Bob Hope a few more times over the years. Industry events, charity functions. They'd shake hands, trade pleasantries. Bob never mentioned the letter, never asked if Johnny had read it, never brought up Christopher, and Johnny never volunteered. They maintained the careful dance of men who've agreed to pretend something never happened. But every time Johnny opened that desk drawer, he saw it. White envelope, slightly bent, getting older, like everything else. Sometimes he'd take it out, hold it, feel the single sheet of paper inside, wonder what it said. Wonder if Christopher Hope was still waiting for some kind of response. Wonder if Bob Hope had ever asked his son about it. Wondering became easier than knowing. In 1985, Johnny's own son, Rick, died in a car accident. He was 39. They'd been distant. Not estranged, just distant. The kind of distance that feels manageable until it's permanent. After the funeral, Johnny went through Rick's apartment, helping to sort through his things. In a desk drawer, he found letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Johnny, all unsent. He read them. Everyone. Sitting on his son's bed, in his son's apartment, reading years of accumulated thoughts that had never been mailed. Rick wrote about feeling invisible. About watching his father on television every night and wondering who that man was. About wanting to connect but not knowing how. About starting letters and never finishing them. Because what was the point? Johnny read them all in one sitting, and when he was done, he sat there holding a stack of his son's unsaid words and thought about Christopher Hope's letter, still in his desk drawer at the studio, still unopened, still waiting. He never opened it. Not even after that. Especially not after that. Because by then he understood what it would say. Every unsent letter says the same thing. I'm here. I'm lost. I don't know how to reach you. Help me. See me. Don't forget me. Bob Hope died in 2003 at the age of 100. The obituaries called him the most honored entertainer in American history. They listed his achievements, his awards, his contributions. They mentioned his children, including Christopher, who gave a quiet interview about his father's complicated legacy. Johnny saw the interview. Christopher was older now, gray-haired, wearing glasses. He spoke carefully about growing up Hope, about the pressure, about the absence disguised as achievement, about learning that fame and fatherhood aren't the same thing, about trying for years to tell his father things that never quite got said. The interviewer asked Christopher about regrets. He paused, looked away from the camera. I wrote him letters, he said quietly. I never knew if he read them. Johnny turned off the television, sat in his living room in Malibu, looked out at the Pacific Ocean, thought about letters, about fathers and sons, about all the things we carry that we never open, because opening them means facing what we've avoided. And sometimes avoidance is the only way we know how to survive. He thought about going to the storage unit where he'd kept things from the show. The envelope would be there, in one of the boxes, still unread, still waiting. He could read it now, write something back, even if Christopher never saw it, even if it was decades too late. He could finally open it, but he didn't. Because Johnny Carson had spent his entire life perfecting the art of control, of keeping things contained, of making sure nobody saw past the curtain. And that envelope, that piece of folded paper that Bob Hope had handed him 40 years ago, represented the thing he feared most: vulnerability, connection, the terrifying possibility of being truly seen. So it stayed closed. Like so many things stay closed. We carry them. We know they're there. We tell ourselves someday. But someday is the place we keep our best intentions, and the rent is always paid in regret. Johnny Carson died in 2005. The obituaries called him the king of late night. They listed his achievements, his ratings, his influence. They mentioned he was intensely private, that he'd been married 4 times, that he'd had 3 sons, that he'd shaped American television. All true, all incomplete. Somewhere in his estate, in boxes of personal effects, there might still be an envelope, white, standard size, bent from years of being carried and stored and moved. A letter from Christopher Hope to Johnny Carson, delivered by a father who couldn't read his own son's words, received by a man who understood that pain so completely he could never face it. 2 men, under bright lights, handing off grief like a baton in a race nobody wins. The audience saw a talk show, saw legends being legends, saw entertainment. They didn't see 2 fathers sitting in the same impossible space, both loving their sons, both failing them, both knowing it, both powerless to change it. The letter stayed sealed, not because what it said didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. Because reading it would mean acknowledging that Johnny Carson, who could handle any guest, any crisis, any moment of live television, could not handle the simple, devastating truth of human connection. We remember Johnny Carson for his timing, his wit, his control, the way he could rescue any conversation, land any joke, make everything look effortless. We remember the legend, the professional, the king, but maybe the real Johnny Carson is in that unread letter, in the thing he couldn't face, in the conversation he couldn't have, not with Christopher Hope, not with his own sons, not with his father, not even with himself. The show always went on, the applause always came, the ratings always held. But after the lights dimmed and the audience went home and the stage was empty, Johnny Carson was alone with an envelope he'd never open. A letter that said everything he'd spent his life avoiding. I am my father's son. I am my son's father. I am lonely in a way that has no cure. I am seen by millions and known by no one. I am performing even when I'm alone, especially when I'm alone. The letter stayed sealed. The distance remained. The silence won. And somewhere in America there were other fathers and sons, other unsaid things, other letters never written or never sent or never opened. Other people watching Johnny Carson every night, laughing at his jokes, thinking he had it all figured out, not knowing that behind that smile, in that desk drawer, in that carefully controlled world, was proof that some things cannot be fixed. Some distances cannot be crossed. Some words, once left unsaid, stay that way forever. The Tonight Show continued. Different hosts, different guests, different decades, but always the same basic formula. Come out, sit down, tell stories, make people laugh, keep moving, never stop, never look too close, never let them see you breaking. Bob Hope's letter to Johnny Carson. Johnny's letters from his son Rick. Christopher Hope's words, frozen in time, all of it sealed away, all of it mattering, none of it opened. Because sometimes the only way we survive what we cannot face is by keeping it carefully folded, tucked away, never quite forgotten but never quite acknowledged. The envelope exists, the words exist, the pain exists. But as long as it stays sealed, we can tell ourselves it might say something else, something easier, something we could handle. We never have to know for certain that we failed the people we loved, that they needed us and we weren't there, that they reached out and we turned away, that they spoke and we refused to listen. As long as the letter stays closed, we can live with the maybe, the possibly, the perhaps. But the people who wrote those letters know the truth. They always did. They weren't writing because they thought we'd respond. They were writing because they had to put the words somewhere, had to make them real, had to try, one more time, to cross a distance that couldn't be crossed. And we keep those letters. We don't throw them away. We put them in drawers and boxes and storage units. We carry them from house to house, decade to decade. We never read them, but we never destroy them either, because destroying them would be final. And as long as they exist, unread, we can tell ourselves that someday, maybe, when we're ready, when the time is right, when we're stronger or braver or more capable, we'll open them. But we won't. We never do, because people who could open those letters wouldn't need to receive them in the first place. Johnny Carson knew that. Bob Hope knew that. Their sons knew that. And everyone watching at home, laughing at the jokes, enjoying the show, they knew it too. We all carry our sealed envelopes. We all have our unread letters. We all know exactly what they say, and we all keep them closed anyway, because that's what we do. That's who we are. That's the show we perform, every day, even when the cameras are off and the audience is gone and there's nobody left to fool but ourselves. The letter stays sealed, the applause fades, the lights go dark, and we're alone with what we cannot face, carrying it with us forever. That's the truth they never showed on television.